Hey there, everybody. My name's Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist, and welcome to my channel. Those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. My name's Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also an author working on my first novel. And on my channel, we dig into the psychology behind writing, the heart of writing, the characters. And the heart of the characters is in what makes them tick, essentially. So we dig into the psychology behind tropes, characters, plot, world building, themes, everything that falls there and in between, because that is how you make a more well rounded world. So, for today, we are continuing with me catching up from last week with my trope diagnosis series. So, for the month of December, I decided to focus on origins. And to start off, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite tropes, which is the human parent and non-human parent. Okay, so this trope is essentially the parents of a main character. One is human, one is not. And the non-human parent can be alien, they can be some sort of fantasy creature, they can be some kind of horror creature. They're just not human. um, and this has actually always been one of my favorites, even though it does require some suspension of disbelief. Um, Mainly because you have to be the same species to produce viable offspring. And by viable, I mean offspring that can have more offspring. For example, a mule is technically an offspring, but it's not what they would call viable because it cannot have other offspring. It's sterile. So, obviously, in fantasy, sci fi, that kind of thing, we usually don't bother with those kind of details. And honestly, I don't get too hung up about it because there's a lot of things in science we don't entirely understand yet. And so I think having a character that is supernatural in some way or otherworldly in some way, being able to reproduce with a human of some kind, I don't consider that entirely out of the realm of possibility. So that's just me. So, what is it about this trope that I like? There's actually two things I like about this trope. One is that it usually pushes the romantic angle with the parents, which I like. I like it when a hero or main character's parents actually love each other and they're actually in a decent relationship, maybe not a perfect relationship, but a decent one. Um, and a lot of times these stories really push despite their differences, I loved him or I loved her. And I'm a sap for that. I like that. The other thing is that the main character is a mix of both sides, and that almost always gives them some kind of additional ability or sense or something. And I like that too because that's entertaining, that's fun. But the thing about this trope is that there's a couple of different angles to it. So I'll just launch into a few of them. One thing I did notice as I was looking over like examples and theories and things like that on this trope, almost always the non-human parent is usually the father. Um, Occasionally it will be the mother, but as a general, it's usually the father. Um, like You'll see this a lot of times in anime. This pops up a lot in anime. In Wolf Children, the father is a wolf man, a werewolf kind of creature. Dragon Ball Z, all the fathers are Saiyan, they're alien. Inuyasha, the father is a demon, a dog spirit. And actually, in Inuyasha, they have a bunch of different half demons that pop up, and except for one of them, all the fathers are the demons are always the father. There was one exception where the demon was the mother, but for the most part, it was always the father. And I actually talked to my husband about this. I'm like, that's interesting. Why do you think that is? And we actually got into an interesting discussion about it where we were thinking about, okay, why are the reasons that the father is usually the supernatural one. And really, what I came up with, in my opinion, just from what I've read and been exposed to, is I think it has to do with the viewpoint that a lot of societies have that the father should be the protector. So the father in these stories has usually additional senses, additional strength, some kind of additional power that a human male does not have. And I think that's kind of why the father is usually the one with the ability. The father is supposed to be the protector and the provider. And it's only in the last couple of years that's really started to shift. I'm starting to see a few more times where the mother is actually the supernatural one. So there is a shift that's happening. But I think that's why most of the time the father was the supernatural one up until this point. The other thing I noticed is that the focus on the supernatural element really depends on what angle the story's taken. So if we're following the main character is the child that is the offspring of these two, then usually they seem to focus more on the human side, which I think is interesting. But anybody that has played like Dungeons and Dragons or any kind of science fiction kind of stories, humans are usually, honestly, they're kind of your trump card a lot of the time. And most of the time it's because we're adaptable. And that usually adaptation and compassion seems to be the traits that humans are really given. We get a lot of credit for that generally in these kind of stories. So those are usually the traits that the offspring almost always will inherit, is the compassion and the adaptability. And that's usually combined with their father or mother's supernatural abilities to create something really powerful, really unique. There is a notable exception to this, and that is Steven Universe. Now, I don't know a lot about it because I'm not a huge fan into it, but I do like it. But it's actually, he gets his compassion from his father, which is a notable shift because usually the traditional female traits usually come from the mother. And I think it's interesting that they took the angle of his father is the one that taught his mother compassion or how to be human. And I like that. That's a neat little shift. That's a neat little switch around. And I wouldn't mind seeing more of that. One of the things I love about this trope is there is so much room for humor in this trope because as the kid grows and it has both these sides that are interacting and they have to deal with it, there's so much stuff you can do with it. I think one of my favorites is in Wolf Children, the children are half human, half wolf. And so they get into fights and turn into wolves and bite at furniture and scratch at things. And it's hilarious because it kind of takes what we know as humans, raising kids is hard enough. Hey, now I'll try raising a kid that can turn into a wolf. And I love it. Another one I always find really interesting is in Dragon Ball Z, both Gohan and Goten are half Saiyan, half human. And they have this immense strength. And just seeing them trying to interact in regular everyday and all these powers and strengths that are coming out, it's funny. Because they're trying to fit in as best they can. And then, here comes this power just out of nowhere. And I like that because it's entertaining. But that does lead to one of my problems with this trope. Starts off very strong and then it starts to kind of peter out. And what I mean by that is usually when we first are introduced, to the children of this supernatural couple, they usually are fairly well balanced. You can see the supernatural side and you can also see the human side, and they work together very well. And that's actually usually a point of what makes them so important, is that they are this mix of this supernatural strength and this human compassion. But what usually seems to happen as the story goes on is usually the kid has to pick a side. They usually kind of find they're always kind of caught in the middle, and the story usually has them lean more to one side or the other. Are they more human? Are they more supernatural? I'm not a huge fan of that angle, simply because I understand why it's used, because there is this psychological need to fit in, and if you are a literal mix of two different races, that's very, very difficult. But at the same time, I think it speaks to the importance of the parents' relationship, that the child eventually comes to terms with the fact that they are not one or the other, they are both. And that's okay, that's good, that's great. But not a lot of stories go that way. They usually have them pick, well, I'm more like my alien side. I'm more like my werewolf side. I'm more like, they pick a side, and usually they pick the side that has power, which, again, understandable. I get it, but I think the message is kind of getting warped when we do that. I much prefer when a character kind of comes to terms with, okay, I have this part from my father or my mother, I have this part from my other parent, and I'm not one or the other, I'm a little mix of both, and that's okay. That's what I want to see more of, is just the mix. Now, granted, genetics is not going to give you literally 50-50. I think a lot of times people assume it does, and genetics are complicated. It's not that simple. But since most of these stories kind of take that angle of half from this, half from that, I think that you should kind of stick to that. Like, okay, if we're saying that this person is a literal, their genes were half and half, then let's embrace the fact that they are half and half. And that's just my take on it. I really like what this trope is capable of, and when it's done well, it's done very well, and I think it has a very good message to it. But when it's done poorly, it's one of those where I think it can send a wrong message. So that's just me. I prefer when the mixture is both a source of contention and also a source of celebration. It's something that you should be proud of and be glad to have, and I want to see more of that. So that's just my take on the human parent, non-human parent. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you guys like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe or leave comments below. I always love reacting and speaking with you guys about this stuff. I hope I will see you guys in the next video, and until then, I hope you guys have a good one.